Her soul was crumbling, navigating the wasteland with absolutely nothing remaining. He existed as a shadow, concealing himself from reality in a forgotten corner of time. When her vehicle fails on Native American territory and she faints near a stream, their lives intertwine unexpectedly. This goes beyond a simple romance tale. It explores two individuals reconstructing their lives from scratch. If you enjoy narratives about recovery, optimism, and discovering belonging in surprising locations, smash that like button. Hit subscribe for more content and leave a comment sharing your location. This wilderness romance will transform your perspective on second chances. The endless expanse spread before Samantha Keller, where scorched amber earth touched the darkening heavens. Her Honda Civic struggled down the dusty path, motor rasping like a wounded creature. She pushed the gas pedal, yet the vehicle offered nothing but mechanical exhaustion before coming to rest completely. Complete stillness. The type of quiet that consumed everything. Her labored breathing, the clicking of cooling engine parts, the soft rustle of wind through desert brush. She remained seated, clutching the wheel until her knuckles became pale, gazing at the dashboard alerts that flashed like judging eyes. Depleted. Everything was depleted. The fuel indicator pointed relentlessly at empty, though she believed she'd refueled in Tucson. Then again, she'd believed many things recently, that Michael cared for her, that her mother would survive, that she could maintain composure long enough to make a difference. Samantha emerged into the scorching heat. Arizona's sun hit her like a tangible force, immediately drawing moisture from her skin. Her medical scrub, still creased from her final shift 3 days prior, stuck to her frame. She'd been traveling since sunrise, perhaps longer. Time had become unreliable, flowing strangely. The surrounding terrain seemed sculpted from ancient visions. Crimson boulders emerged from the ground like bones of slumbering titans, while distant peaks shimmered like illusions. This was Apache territory, she recognized suddenly. She'd noticed the markers along the main road, but they'd barely penetrated her exhaustion-induced haze. She grabbed her phone. No reception, naturally. The sun rose higher, bringing with it an unusual lightness. Her sight blurred around the edges, and she discovered herself moving, though she couldn't recall choosing to walk. Each stride felt more burdensome than the previous, as though the ground itself pulled her downward. Water existed somewhere nearby. She could detect it, a gentle murmuring that seemed to originate within her mind. Following this sound, she stumbled through clusters of prickly pear and barrel cacti, their spines snagging her garments like grasping digits. The stream materialized suddenly, a silver ribbon slicing through red stone. She dropped to her knees at its bank, gathering the cool liquid to her mouth. It carried the taste of earth, minerals and open sky, of something timeless and patient. I should return to the vehicle, she considered, but her body wouldn't comply. The rocks beneath felt comfortable, inviting. She reclined beside the flowing water, one hand drifting in the current, and shut her eyes. Between consciousness and dreams, she detected footsteps, quiet, purposeful, like someone who understood how to move without disturbing nature. But when she attempted to open her eyes, the sun had completely drained her energy. Her final memory was a man's shadow, crossing her face and hands, weathered yet gentle, lifting her from the earth. Awareness returned gradually, like dawn breaking through thick drapes. Samantha's initial feeling was coolness, blessed, complete coolness that seemed to embrace her body like flowing water. The second was wood smoke's scent, combined with something botanical, something that reminded her of her grandmother's garden. She opened her eyes to rough-hewn ceiling beams and weathered wooden walls. Sunlight streamed through a single window, creating geometric designs across flooring swept clean as polished bone. She rested on a narrow bed, covered with wool blankets that felt hand-woven, their designs geometric and exact. Moving cautiously, she sat upright. Her head throbbed, but her mouth no longer felt like desert sand. A clay pitcher and cup sat on a small bedside table, both containing water so pure it seemed to capture light itself. She drank deeply, and the liquid tasted of the same minerals and sky she recalled from the creek. The cabin was compact, yet perfectly arranged. Shelves covered one wall, displaying jars of dried plants, carved wooden vessels, and what appeared to be handcrafted implements. A stone hearth dominated the far wall, cold currently, but radiating remembered warmth. Everything suggested hands that worked with purpose, a life lived with intention. She heard activity outside, the gentle impact of an axe striking wood. Through the window she glimpsed movement, a figure chopping logs with the rhythm that indicated muscle memory and years of experience. Her clothing had been replaced. Gone were her wrinkled scrubs, substituted with a simple cotton garment that reached her knees. It was clean and repaired, though clearly worn by previous owners. Someone had undressed her, tended to her while unconscious. The thought should have alarmed her, but instead she felt only peculiar thankfulness. The chopping ceased, footsteps drew near, and the door opened without announcement. He completely filled the entrance, tall, broad-shouldered, with skin like burnished copper and hair so dark it seemed to swallow light. His age was hard to determine. His face showed the weathering that spoke of outdoor labor and careful observation of the world, but his eyes, dark as river stones, held depths that suggested old pain, carefully controlled. He stood there momentarily, examining her face with the same focus she'd seen her patients give medical records. Finally he stepped inside, moving with the fluid grace of someone comfortable in confined spaces. "Water," he said, his voice rough from lack of use. He indicated the pitcher. "Drink more." She complied, surprised by the certainty in his tone. It wasn't commanding so much as confident, as if he understood her body's requirements better than she did. "Thank you," she managed. "For everything." He nodded once, briefly, and approached the shelves. His hand selected items with the same careful precision. A bundle of dried leaves, a small clay vessel, matches that appeared hand-carved. He worked silently, and Samantha found herself observing the exact movements of his fingers, how he measured herbs without weighing them. "I'm Samantha," she offered when the quiet stretched too long. "Talon." The name came without explanation, as if it contained all necessary information. He built a small fire in the fireplace, then placed a kettle of water to warm. The familiar household sounds, the whisper of flames, the gradual heating of metal, created an intimacy that felt both strange and essential. When had she last sat quietly while someone else worked? When had she last received care without expectation of reciprocation? "My car," she said. "I should— tomorrow." He spoke without turning from the fire. "Today you rest." Something in his tone prevented argument. Samantha settled back against the pillows, surprised to find herself relieved. For the first time in months, someone else was making decisions. Someone else was carrying the burden. The tea he prepared tasted of sage and something sweet, something that evoked childhood summers and her mother's hands braiding her hair. She sipped it slowly, watching Talon move around the small space with the efficiency of long practice. He spoke no more, but his presence filled the cabin like warmth. As afternoon light began to angle through the window, Samantha felt her eyelids growing heavy again. The tea, the coolness, the steady rhythm of Talon's movements, everything conspired toward sleep. She resisted for a moment, this uncharacteristic surrender, but her body had already decided. Just before she drifted off, she saw him place a small object on the table beside her water cup, a piece of turquoise no larger than her thumb, polished, smooth and warm to touch. When she closed her fingers around it, the stone seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Days flowed in a rhythm Samantha had never experienced. She awakened to the sound of Talon moving around the cabin, always quietly, always purposefully. He would leave bread beside her bed, dense, dark loaves that tasted of grain and patience, along with honey that held the essence of desert blooms. Her strength returned slowly, like water seeping back into dried earth. On the third day, she managed to sit outside in the single wooden chair that faced the creek. The landscape that had seemed threatening before now revealed its subtle magnificence. How morning light transformed the red rocks to flame, how shadows moved across canyon walls, like living entities. Talon worked within view but rarely spoke. She observed him tending a small garden where corn, beans and squash grew in orderly rows. His hands moved through the plants with the same attention she'd seen him give everything else, as if each leaf, each developing fruit, deserved individual consideration. On the fourth day he brought her a journal. The leather cover was worn smooth by many hands, and the pages inside were thick cream-colored paper that seemed to invite touch. He placed it beside her without explanation, along with a pen carved from what looked like juniper wood. "For what?" she asked. He gestured toward the landscape, toward the garden, toward the creek that ran endlessly past the cabin. "Everything," he said simply. She began tentatively, describing the play of light on water, the sound wind made moving through sage. But as days passed, the words came easier. She wrote about the careful way Talon stacked firewood, each piece placed with intention, about the herbs he gathered at dawn when their essential oils were strongest, about the way he sat by the fire in the evenings, his stillness so complete it seemed to draw silence from the very air. Gradually she began to write about herself, about the hospital where she'd worked for 7 years, about patients who died despite her care, about the slow dissolution of her marriage to a man who'd mistaken control for love, about her mother's final months when pain had stolen everything that had made her who she was. Talon read nothing she wrote, but somehow he seemed to know when the words had been particularly difficult. On those evenings, he would brew tea that tasted of chamomile and something else, something that loosened the knots in her chest. He would sit closer to her by the fire, his presence a steady warmth she found herself depending on. On the 7th day, he began teaching her. It started with the garden. He showed her how to read the soil's moisture with her fingertips, how to distinguish between plants that welcomed touch and those that preferred solitude. His hands guided hers as they harvested tomatoes, their skin warm from the sun. Perfect in their imperfection. "Plants know," he said, one of his rare complete sentences, "when you care, when you don't." She thought of her patients, how they'd seemed to sense her emotional state even when she'd tried to hide it behind professional competence. "People too," she said. He nodded, his dark eyes meeting hers for a moment longer than usual. "Yes." The afternoons became lessons in other kinds of attention. He taught her to start a fire using only flint and steel, her hands growing sure through repetition. He showed her which plants could heal and which could harm, how to prepare tinctures that could soothe pain or promote sleep. "Why are you teaching me this?" she asked one evening as they worked together, grinding dried herbs with a mortar and pestle carved from stone. Talon was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then, "Because you forgot you were strong." The words hit her like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Somewhere in the course of taking care of everyone else, patience, husband, dying mother, she had forgotten her own substance, her own capacity to heal and be healed. That night, she wrote until her hand cramped, pouring years of accumulated silence onto paper. When she finally slept, she dreamed of her mother's hands teaching her to braid her hair, of patients who had thanked her with their eyes when words failed them, of Talon's steady presence anchoring her to something she'd thought she'd lost forever. The turquoise stone, always warm in her palm, seemed to pulse with newfound life. The morning of her second week, Samantha woke to find Talon gone. His absence created a hollow space in the cabin's atmosphere, and she found herself listening for his footsteps with an intensity that surprised her. She'd grown accustomed to his presence in ways that went deeper than comfort. She dressed in another of the simple cotton dresses — he seemed to have several, all clean and mended — and made her way outside. The garden needed watering. She could tell by the slight droop of the bean leaves. The knowledge pleased her, evidence that his teachings had taken root. As she worked, moving between rows with the careful attention he'd taught her, she heard voices carrying across the canyon. Following the sound, she climbed a small rise behind the cabin and looked down into a clearing where Talon stood with 3 young men. They moved in practiced patterns, their bodies flowing through what looked like a combination of combat techniques and dance. Talon called out occasional corrections, his voice carrying an authority she hadn't heard before. The young men, teenagers she realized, listened with the kind of attention reserved for someone deeply respected. She watched, mesmerized, as Talon demonstrated a complex series of movements. His body spoke a language of controlled power, each gesture economical and precise. But as he turned, lifting his arms above his head, his shirt rode up, and Samantha saw the scars. They crossed his back in irregular patterns, some straight and clean like surgical incisions, others jagged and angry. Old burns, she realized with her nurse's eye. Shrapnel wounds. The kind of damage that spoke of explosions, of violence endured far from home. When the lesson ended, the young men departed with respectful nods. Talon remained in the clearing, his hands resting on a wooden staff worn smooth by use. Samantha made her way down the slope, her feet finding the path he'd worn through years of walking. "I teach them to fight," she said when she reached him. "I teach them to survive." His voice held no emotion, but she caught the slight tension in his shoulders. "Were you a soldier?" The question hung between them like smoke. For a moment, she thought he might not answer, might retreat into the silence that seemed to be his natural state. Then he lifted his eyes to meet hers, and she saw in them a pain so carefully contained it made her chest ache. "3 tours," he said simply. Afghanistan. She wanted to ask more. When, with whom, what had brought him back to this place that seemed so far from the world of uniforms and missions? But something in his posture warned her away from direct questions. Instead, she said, "I saw the scars." His hands tightened slightly on the staff. "Most people pretend they don't. I'm a nurse. I've seen scars before." She moved closer, close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes, the gray that threaded through his black hair. "They tell stories." "Not stories I want to tell." "Maybe not, but they're part of you now." Talon turned to study her face with the same careful attention he gave to everything else. "You have scars, too," he said finally. "Different kind." The observation struck her silent. She thought of Michael's voice raised in anger, of her mother's. Final weeks when every breath had been a struggle, of the patients she'd lost despite everything she'd known how to do. Yes, she had scars, they just weren't visible. "How do you live with them?" she asked. "Carefully," he said. "One day at a time." They walked back to the cabin together, and for the first time since her arrival, the silence between them felt charged. with possibility rather than simple peace. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Samantha found herself writing about the weight of memory, about the way trauma could reshape a person's entire geography. When she looked up, Talon was watching her, his dark eyes reflecting firelight. For a moment she felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with her external circumstances and everything to do with the careful attention one broken thing could give to another. The turquoise stone warming in her palm seemed to pulse with recognition. The invitation came through gesture rather than words. On her 15th day in the cabin, Talon appeared after breakfast carrying a second pack, clearly meant for her. His meaning was obvious. Today they would travel. The path he chose wound through canyon country, following water courses that had carved impossible shapes into the red stone. Samantha's legs, strengthened by days of garden work and gentle movement, found their rhythm quickly. She'd forgotten the simple pleasure of walking without destination, of moving through landscape for the sake of movement itself. Talon set a pace that allowed for attention to the way light changed as they moved through shadow and sun, to the calls of birds she was learning to identify, to the subtle shifts in vegetation that spoke of underground water or particular soil conditions. He stopped frequently, not from fatigue, but to point out things she might otherwise miss. A hawk's nest tucked impossibly high in the canyon wall, the tracks of a mountain lion pressed into soft earth beside a spring, the way certain plants grew only in association with others. Everything connected, he said during one such stop, his hand indicating the intricate relationships between stone, water, plant, and animal life. Nothing exists alone. The observation seemed to contain layers of meaning, and Samantha found herself thinking about the isolation she'd cultivated in her previous life, the way she'd learned to function independently, to need nothing from anyone. The strategy had felt like strength, but perhaps it had been something else entirely. They climbed steadily through the morning, following switchbacks that revealed the landscape's hidden geometries. At midday they reached a place where the canyon opened into a broad valley, and Samantha saw buildings in the distance, low earth-colored structures that seemed to grow from the landscape itself. "The village," Talon said, the first words he'd spoken in over an hour. As they approached, people emerged from the buildings, women hanging laundry, children playing in the dusty spaces between houses, men working on various projects with the kind of focused attention she'd learned to associate with this place. Several people called greetings to Talon, their voices warm with familiarity, but Samantha noticed how he held himself slightly apart, how his responses, while polite, maintained a certain distance. An older woman approached, her grey hair braided with red thread, her movements conveying an authority that needed no external validation. Her eyes, the same dark brown as Talon's, swept over Samantha with frank curiosity. "Grandmother," Talon said, and Samantha heard genuine warmth in his voice for the first time. "Yazi," the woman corrected, extending her hand to Samantha. "And you are the woman who fell from the sky." The description caught Samantha off guard, and she saw amusement flicker in the older woman's eyes. "Samantha Keller," she said, taking the offered hand. Yazi's grip was firm, calloused from decades of work, but her palm was warm. "Come," Yazi said, already turning toward one of the larger buildings. "We have things to discuss." The interior of Yazi's house spoke of generations, of careful living. Woven rugs covered adobe floors, and the walls held photographs spanning decades, family gatherings, ceremonies, children at various stages of growth. But it was the smell that struck Samantha most strongly. Sage and cedar, cooking food and something else. Something that made her think of her own grandmother's house, of childhood afternoons spent learning to knead bread. Yazi moved through the space with the efficiency of long practice, setting water to heat, arranging cushions around a low table. Talon followed, but Samantha noticed how his shoulders had tensed, how his movements had become more guarded. "Sit," Yazi commanded, and they both obeyed. Over tea that tasted of wild mint and something faintly bitter, Yazi asked questions that seemed simple but weren't. Where had Samantha come from? What had brought her to this place? What did she hope to find? Samantha found herself speaking more freely than she had expected, describing her work at the hospital, her failed marriage, her mother's death. But as she talked, she became aware of Talon's increasing stillness, the way he held his cup without drinking, his attention focused on some middle distance. "And now?" Yazi asked when Samantha had finished. "I don't know," Samantha admitted. "I've been running from everything for so long, I'm not sure I remember what I was running to." Yazi nodded as if this were a reasonable response. "Running is sometimes necessary," she said, "but eventually you have to stop and face the direction you're pointing." She turned her attention to Talon, and her voice took on a different quality, gentler but more penetrating. "How you have been teaching her?" "Some things," Talon replied carefully. "Good. She needs to understand before she decides." "Decides what?" Samantha asked. Yazi smiled, and Samantha caught a glimpse of the young woman she must once have been. "Whether to stay or keep running," she said simply. That evening, back at the cabin, Talon was different. Not distant exactly, but preoccupied in a way that made the space feel larger, emptier. He prepared dinner, fresh trout he'd caught somewhere during their walk, cooked simply with herbs from the garden, but ate little himself. Samantha watched him across the small table, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his hands moved restlessly when he thought she wasn't looking. Finally, she set down her fork and spoke the question that had been forming all afternoon. "What did Yazi mean about understanding before I decide?" Talon's hands stilled. For a moment she thought he might not answer, might retreat into the silence that seemed to be his natural refuge. Then he pushed back from the table and moved to the window, his silhouette dark against the gathering dusk. "This place," he said finally, "it's not temporary for me. It's where I came to heal, where I came to stay." A pause. "And people don't usually stay." His voice carried no emotion, but she caught the slight tightening of his shoulders. "They visit. They learn some things, they leave." The words hung between them, and Samantha felt their weight settle in her chest. Of course, she was a tourist here, however accidental her arrival. She had a life to return to, a job, an apartment, responsibilities that existed beyond this timeless place. But even as she thought it, she realized how distant those things felt, how insubstantial compared to the immediate reality of this cabin, this man, this daily rhythm of attention and care. "What if," she said carefully, "someone didn't want to leave?" Talon turned from the window, and in the lamplight his face looked carved from stone. "This isn't a place you can visit on weekends," he said. "It's not something you can add to your other life. If you stay completely. And if I don't?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Then you don't." The simplicity of it struck her silent. Here was no plea, no attempt at persuasion, just a statement of fact, delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone he used to discuss weather or garden conditions. Part 2 Desert Choice. Rewritten version beneath his words, she detected something deeper, a measured restraint born from experience, from heartbreak weathered and held within. That evening she scribbled until her fingers ached, attempting to grasp the essence of the decision forming before her. On one path stretched all things known, her profession, her Phoenix condo, the familiar ache of predictable days. on the other, waited this new reality. The pure joy of nurturing growth, the deep stillness of existence aligned with nature's rhythm, the unwavering companionship of someone who demanded nothing yet offered all. Yet another element lingered, indefinable, a recognition that remaining here wouldn't simply relocate her body, but transform her very essence. The person who'd arrived in this wilderness bore little resemblance to the one now seated beside flickering flames, pen moving across pages of artisan-crafted paper. The blue-green stone rested warm against her skin, seeming to throb with its own restless pulse. Lifting her gaze, she discovered Talon had vanished. Beyond the glass, she spotted him beside the stream, his stance reflecting the sort of contemplation earned through decades of discipline. She longed to approach him, to provide comfort or certainty. Yet something restrained her. Instead, she shut the notebook and readied herself for sleep, though rest proved elusive. Outside, the water's perpetual whisper mingled with the desert's nighttime vastness, a quiet that seemed to hold infinite potential and none at all. Morning arrived with Talon already absent. She discovered fresh coffee still steaming and cloth-wrapped bread near the stove, accompanied by a message in precise, capital letters, "Gone to town back evening." This departure felt distinct from his typical trips, more intentional, more urgent. Samantha followed their established morning pattern, nurturing the garden, inspecting the traps he'd shown her how to construct, preparing modest meals from his methodically organized provisions. Yet by afternoon the quiet had grown heavy. She caught herself straining for footsteps, his voice the subtle sounds of his existence that had woven themselves into her daily fabric. When had she started depending on him? When had his constancy shifted from merely pleasant to absolutely necessary? Seeking distraction, she wandered to unexplored corners of the property. Beyond the cabin stood a workshop containing tools organized with the same meticulous care, evident throughout Talon's world. Primarily woodworking implements, though metalworking gear and unfamiliar materials also occupied the space. Partially, completed works filled the shelves, vessels shaped from burl, blade handles crafted from antler, apparent jewelry forged from precious metals and stones. In one corner, something larger hid beneath tarp. Curiosity conquering restraint, she pulled away the covering and inhaled sharply. A canoe rested there, unlike anything she'd encountered. The timber gleamed with oils and devoted craftsmanship, each line flowing seamlessly into the next with natural perfection. The artistry was remarkable, speaking of inherited knowledge honed through endless hours of dedication. Magnificent, wouldn't you say? Samantha whirled to discover Yazi in the doorway, her arrival somehow expected despite her silent approach. "How much time goes into creating something like this?" Samantha inquired, trailing fingers along the polished rail. "This particular one? Perhaps 2 years," Yazi replied, stepping closer, though he spent his entire existence learning the craft. They remained together in easy quiet, admiring the vessel's flawless proportions. Eventually, Yazi continued. "He constructs one periodically, always gives them away." Her tone carried gentle humor. "Claims they aren't meant for keeping." "Who receives them?" "Usually young men, when they're prepared to depart the reservation for education or employment, something to recall their origins." Yazi's hand joined Samantha's on the wooden edge. "This one's different, however." "How so?" "He began it after your arrival." The revelation struck Samantha like a physical impact. She examined the canoe anew, noticing details previously overlooked. The refined curves seemingly intended for 2 occupants, the exceptional attention to detail, the way each component merged with impossible elegance. "For me," she whispered. "Perhaps. Or possibly for both of you." Yazi's voice carried no judgment, merely observation. Sometimes a present is simultaneously a decision. That evening, Talon returned bearing supplies and town news. Federal agents were questioning recent reservation fires, he explained. Insurance. Assessors and officials who comprehended nothing about the bond between land and inhabitants. His expression as he spoke maintained the careful neutrality she'd learned to associate with his discussions of the external world. Following dinner, he guided her to the workshop without explanation. When he removed the canvas from the canoe, his movements possessed a ceremony she hadn't witnessed before. "I wanted you to see it completed," he said simply. The vessel seemed to radiate light in the lamp glow, every surface flawless, every connection invisible. Samantha extended her hand to touch it, then hesitated, suddenly uncertain. "It's magnificent," she said, the words feeling inadequate. "It's yours," Talon responded. "If you desire it." The offer suspended between them, heavy with unspoken implications. A canoe suggested water, suggested journeys, suggested the assumption of a paddling companion, yet it also implied permanence, the type of gift offered to those planning to remain. "I don't know how to paddle," she admitted. For the first time in days, Talon smiled. "I can instruct you." That night, she wrote nothing. Instead, she sat beside the fire, clutching the turquoise stone, contemplating gifts that doubled as choices, considering the distinction between desiring something and being prepared to accept it. The smoke manifested initially as a slender line against the eastern horizon, grey against morning sky. Talon noticed it while they worked the garden together, his hands freezing on tomato vines as he raised his head to sample the breeze. "Fire," he announced, the single word carrying weight. Within 60 minutes the line had expanded into a column, and by afternoon the sharp scent of burning sage and oak reached the cabin. Talon moved through preparations with military precision, filling water containers, establishing defensible perimeters around structures, organizing crucial supplies into portable bundles. "How near?" Samantha asked, observing his work. "Near enough," he answered without elaboration. That evening, as they sat outside monitoring the orange luminescence now silhouetting the eastern peaks, a vehicle arrived carrying 3 young men from the village. They conversed rapidly in Apache, their voices urgent yet controlled. Talon listened without interruption, then rose and vanished into the cabin. When he reappeared, he wore different clothing, work trousers instead of denim, boots showing heavy use, a shirt that looked battle-tested. His manner had transformed as well, adopting the concentrated intensity she'd glimpsed during his teaching sessions with the youths. "I must leave," he stated simply. "Where?" The fire crossed the road. "Families remain in danger." His hands moved as he spoke, checking gear with practiced efficiency. "Evacuation routes are blocked." Samantha felt ice settle in her stomach. "How dangerous?" Talon's gaze met hers, and she recognized the same measured control she'd learned to interpret as profound emotion restrained. Dangerous enough. The thought of him entering flames while she waited safely felt impossible. She'd dedicated 7 years as a trauma nurse, 7 years racing toward crises while others retreated. The concept of remaining behind, secure and useless, contradicted everything she understood about herself. "I'm accompanying you," she declared. "No." The response came without pause, absolute in its finality. "I'm a nurse, Talon. I can assist. You lack training for this." His voice softened slightly, but the decision remained immovable. "Fire behaves differently here. The landscape is hazardous, even without emergency circumstances." She wanted to protest, to assert her competence, her right to choose her own dangers. Yet something in his posture, the way he held himself like someone preparing for combat, silenced her. Instead, she moved close enough to touch his arm. "Return to me," she said simply. The words appeared to surprise him. Momentarily, his careful control wavered, and she glimpsed something raw and uncertain in his expression. Then he covered her hand with his, palm warm and rough. "I will," he promised. They departed as sunset arrived, 4 silhouettes dissolving into smoke-hazed darkness. Samantha remained in the cabin entrance until their vehicle's taillights disappeared, then went inside to wait. The hours stretched endlessly. She attempted reading, writing, occupying herself with minor tasks, but her focus kept returning to the windows, to the orange glow that appeared to be intensifying. By midnight, she could hear the fire itself, a distant rumbling like wind through an enormous cavern. At 3 a.m., the electricity failed. The silence felt different without electrical humming, deeper and more menacing. She lit candles and oil lamps, creating pools of illumination in the expanding darkness. Dawn arrived gray and dense with smoke. The eastern sky, typically clear and boundless, had vanished behind a haze wall, and still no word from Talon. By midday, Samantha had reached her decision. If he wouldn't return to her, she would seek him out. The village, when she arrived, had transformed into an emergency command center. People moved with determined urgency, loading vehicles with provisions, coordinating evacuation paths, tending families whose homes lay in the fire's trajectory. The air was thick enough to taste, ash falling like gray precipitation on everything. Samantha located Yazi at the community center, managing operations with the composed authority born from surviving previous emergencies. Upon seeing Samantha, her expression shifted, not exactly surprised, but knowing. "He hasn't returned," Yazi stated before Samantha could speak. "Where is he?" "Canyon Creek drainage. There was a family, grandparents unable to evacuate independently." Yazi's hands continued moving as she spoke, never pausing in their work. "He went in with the boys to retrieve them." "When?" "Yesterday evening." Yazi glanced at the smoke-obscured sun. "Should have been back by now." The words struck Samantha like physical blows. Nearly 18 hours in fire territory with inadequate communication and shifting conditions. She considered his scarred back, his careful control suggesting trauma absorbed and contained. What if this crisis had triggered something he couldn't handle? What if he was injured, trapped, worse? "I need to search for him," she said. Yazi studied her face with the same careful attention Talon always displayed. "You know Canyon Creek's location?" "No, but I can learn. It's hazardous even for someone familiar with the terrain. More hazardous than abandoning him out there." Yazi remained quiet momentarily, her eyes weighing something Samantha couldn't perceive. Finally, she nodded once decisively. "Miguel," she called to one of the young men loading supplies. "Come here." The following hour blurred with preparation. Maps, water, basic medical equipment, a radio that might function in canyon country. Miguel, barely 18 but clearly capable, would guide her to Talon's team's last known position. As they prepared to depart, Yazi grasped Samantha's arm with gentle firmness. "He's unaccustomed to people caring whether he returns," she said quietly. "For a long time it mattered to no one except him." The words created an empty space in Samantha's chest. She considered Talon's careful self-reliance, his method of giving, without expecting reciprocation, the distance he maintained even in generosity. How long had he been living as though his presence mattered to nobody? "It matters to me," she said. Yazi smiled, not with amusement, but with recognition. "I know. That's why you're going." The drive into the fire zone resembled entering another realm. Landscape familiar from weeks of daily walks had become alien and threatening. Smoke transformed the sky sepia, and wind carried sounds that didn't belong, crashing timber, flames roaring as they consumed decades of accumulated fuel. Miguel drove, with focused attention, navigating by landmarks that kept vanishing. Road markers were obscured by smoke, familiar structures shrouded until they resembled ghosts of themselves. Yet he seemed to carry an internal map, turning at intersections that appeared identical to Samantha, following roads leading deeper into the emergency. "There," he said finally, indicating a cluster of vehicles barely visible through the haze. "Base camp." Emergency response's organized chaos surrounded them. Firefighters in yellow suits, incident commanders hunched over maps, communication specialists maintaining contact with teams scattered across the landscape. The air hummed with radio chatter, mostly technical jargon discussing wind speeds, fuel moisture, containment lines. A woman in a smoke-stained jacket approached their vehicle, her movements efficient despite obvious exhaustion. "You're the nurse?" she asked Samantha directly. "Yes, I'm seeking Talon's team." "I know." The woman gestured toward the smoke-obscured canyon. "They evacuated the family but encountered a flare-up on their exit route. Lost radio contact approximately 6 hours ago." 6 hours. Samantha felt the number settle in her chest like stone. In emergency medicine, 6 hours could mean the difference between recovery and permanent damage, between survival and something worse. "Where?" she asked. The incident commander indicated a map location where red lines marked active fire boundaries. "Here, but we can't deploy resources until wind shifts. Too dangerous for ground crews, too smoky for air support." Samantha studied the map, comparing it to terrain knowledge gained through weeks of walking with Talon. "What about this route?" She traced a line skirting the main fire area, following what appeared to be a creek drainage. "Possible," the commander admitted reluctantly, "but you'd be going alone without backup if conditions change." "I understand the risks." The woman examined Samantha's face with the same careful assessment she'd learned to expect from people in this place. Finally, she nodded. "Radio check every 30 minutes, she said. "If we don't hear from you, we assume you're in trouble." Miguel handed Samantha a pack loaded with water and basic supplies. "Follow the creek," he said. "It leads to where they were last seen. But, Senora," his young face grew serious with worry, "if you find them injured, don't attempt moving them. Call for help and wait." "I will," she promised, though both knew conditions might not permit such careful protocols. As she departed into the smoke-hazed landscape, Samantha felt her decision's weight settle around her like gravity. Behind lay safety, rational choice, the sensible decision to await professionals. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the slim possibility of finding the man who had taught her to recognize strength in stillness, healing, in attention, love in life's careful daily tending. Yet there was no real choice. He had come to her when she was broken and lost. Now it was her turn to go to him. The landscape Samantha entered seemed to exist beyond normal time. Smoke transformed, familiar shapes into mysteries, and the sun, when visible, appeared as a dim orange disk floating in grey haze. She followed Miguel's indicated creek, but its usual cheerful babbling was muffled by heavy air's strange acoustics. Her radio crackled periodically with distant voices, progress reports, equipment requests, the constant coordination required to fight a fire behaving according to its own incomprehensible logic. Every 30 minutes she checked in as promised, her voice sounding small and isolated in the vast emergency. Terrain grew more challenging as she climbed. What had been gentle slopes during walks with Talon became serious obstacles when visibility dropped to mere yards. She found herself navigating by touch as much as sight, her hands reading stone and soil texture the way he'd taught her to read plants' needs. After 2 hours, she discovered the first sign of their passage. tire tracks. In soft earth beside the creek, fresh enough to show clear tread patterns. Relief was immediate and overwhelming. She was on the right track. But as she followed the tracks deeper into the canyon, fire signs became more immediate. Scattered ash covered everything like grey snow, and the air itself seemed to burn her. Lungs with each breath. Trees displayed characteristic black scorch marks of ground fire, and in the distance she could hear flames feeding on dry fuel. The radio crackled. "Samantha, this is base camp. How's your progress?" She keyed the microphone. "Following vehicle tracks, signs of recent passage. Visibility maybe 50 yards. Copy that. Be advised. Weather station shows wind shift possible in next 2 hours. That could change fire behavior rapidly. Understood." But even as she acknowledged the warning, Samantha felt forward motion's pull. Somewhere ahead, Talon might be hurt, trapped, waiting for help that wasn't coming through official channels. The thought of turning back felt impossible. The tracks led to where the canyon narrowed, forcing the creek through a gap between high stone walls. Here she found the truck, a Forest Service vehicle with damage speaking of hasty evacuation. The windshield was spiderwebbed with cracks. Scorch marks along the sides showed how close fire had come, but the truck was empty. Samantha circled the vehicle, seeking signs of the team's direction. On the far side, she found them. Footprints, in soft earth beside the creek. 5 sets moving away from the truck toward higher ground. One set showed the irregular pattern of someone being supported, and she felt her heart clench with professional recognition. Someone was hurt. The trail led up the canyon wall along what might have been a game path, steep enough to require hands as well as feet. Samantha followed, her nurse's training supplying detailed scenarios for what she might find. Smoke inhalation, burns, trauma from falling debris. Each possibility carried its own protocols, requirements for care she might or might not be able to provide in field conditions. Halfway up the slope, she found the first clear sign of trouble, blood droplets on stone, recent enough to still show, bright red against rock. Not arterial bleeding, the pattern was wrong for that, but sufficient to indicate significant injury. "Base camp, this is Samantha," she radioed. "I found their vehicle and blood trail, following on foot toward higher ground. Copy. Medical helicopter is standing by, but we need confirmation of conditions before we can launch. I'll let you know." What I find? The path leveled onto a narrow ledge running along the canyon wall. Here, sheltered from direct view of the fire below, she found them. Talon sat with his back against the stone wall, one of the elderly evacuees cradled against his chest. The old man's breathing was labored, and even from a distance, Samantha could see smoke inhalation signs. The other 2 team members lay nearby, one conscious but clearly favoring his left arm, the other motionless in a way that sent professional alarm through her system. "Talon," she called softly. He looked up. And she saw in his eyes a mixture of relief and something else, surprise, as if he hadn't quite believed anyone would come looking. "You shouldn't be here," he said, but his voice held no real criticism. Neither should you, apparently. She knelt beside the unconscious team member, her hands automatically beginning assessment, pulse rapid but strong, breathing shallow but regular, pupils responsive. Likely concussion, possibly from falling debris. "Miguel's grandfather," Talon said, nodding toward the old man in his arms. "Smoke got to him before we could escape." Samantha moved to assess the elderly evacuee, her training taking over completely. Severe smoke inhalation, possibly complicated by underlying heart condition. He needed oxygen, professional medical care, evacuation to a facility equipped for respiratory emergencies. How long has he been like this? Part 3, Desert Hearts. A story of love and healing. 3 or possibly 4 hours had passed, far too lengthy for someone of his advanced years, enduring such severe conditions. Yet she set aside her clinical pessimism and concentrated on urgent treatment, ensuring his airways remained clear, adjusting his position for better breathing, monitoring his vital signs with the portable medical gear she'd carried with her. Communication. Device? She inquired. The truck's radio was destroyed during the rockslide, responded the alert team member. Samantha activated her own communication device. Base camp, Samantha here. Located the missing team. Urgent medical helicopter needed. 2 severely wounded, 1 in critical condition. Static filled the airwaves before the signal cleared. Understood. Can you establish a helicopter landing area? She surveyed the cramped ledge, towering canyon walls, and flames dancing below. Helicopter landing impossible. Ground evacuation required. Acknowledged. Ground teams are preparing equipment, but reaching your position will take a minimum of 2 hours. 2 hours. Samantha observed the elderly man's pallid complexion and increasingly difficult breathing. He wouldn't survive that long. I'll transport him myself, she declared. Talon's gaze locked with hers over the injured person. The trail's too constricted, too treacherous. Then we'll expand it. What unfolded next was 2 hours of the most grueling physical labor Samantha had ever experienced. Using salvaged equipment from the wrecked vehicle, they broadened the animal path sufficiently to accommodate a makeshift stretcher constructed from tarps and tree limbs. The conscious team member, despite his damaged arm, labored beside them. With fierce resolve, Talon spoke sparingly throughout the effort, yet Samantha sensed his presence like an unwavering foundation. When her energy waned, he stepped in seamlessly. When uncertainty arose about their improvised medical setup, his calm assurance propelled her forward. Gradually, with painstaking care, they advanced toward assistance. The rescue operation lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of cautious navigation through terrain that tested every movement, monitoring vital statistics that shifted alarmingly, maintaining optimism against mounting challenges. When they finally arrived at the staging location, where professional medical teams awaited, Samantha's clothing was drenched in perspiration, her hands trembling from fatigue. Yet they had succeeded. All of them. The elderly gentleman, Miguel's grandfather, as she discovered, was immediately airlifted to a Phoenix trauma facility. His outlook remained uncertain but encouraging. The team member with head trauma would make a full recovery with rest and observation. Even the injured arm proved to be merely a simple break, easily remedied. You preserved his life, the emergency doctor informed Samantha as they observed the helicopter vanishing into the brightening sky. 1 more hour, perhaps 2, and we would have lost him. These words should have felt triumphant, but Samantha found herself too drained for celebration. She perched on an ambulance tailgate, accepting coffee from a paramedic who appeared nearly as weary as she felt, attempting to comprehend what had just occurred. She had ventured into flames, literally entered an active crisis zone to locate someone important to her. The woman who had arrived in this wilderness 3 weeks prior, cautious, restrained, fearful of her emotional requirements, would never have made such a decision. Excellent work today, she heard, looking up to discover Talon beside the ambulance, his own exhaustion visible in his posture. Soot and debris had grayed his clothes, and a gash on his forehead revealed close encounters with falling wreckage. We performed excellent work, she amended. He examined her expression with the thoughtful scrutiny she'd come to anticipate from him. I assumed you'd returned to Phoenix. I believed you might require assistance. I did. The confession appeared to startle him as much as it did her. For weeks, she'd observed him navigate the world with complete independence, requesting nothing from anyone. Hearing him admit to needing help felt like receiving a precious gift. They returned to the cabin in peaceful silence, too exhausted for discussion, yet not isolated. The terrain they traversed bore evidence of the fire's path: charred vegetation, emergency vehicles, the systematic aftermath of disaster. However, immediate peril had subsided, and life was already reasserting itself through small details: birds returning to cleared spaces, green shoots emerging through ash, people beginning recovery efforts. At the cabin, Samantha rediscovered muscles she'd forgotten existed. Every motion reminded her of the day's physical demands, yet satisfaction accompanied the soreness. She had pushed her body beyond perceived limits and found reserves she hadn't known she possessed. Talon constructed a fire while she cleansed, away the soot and ash. Upon emerging, he had arranged food: simple bread and cheese, garden fruit, water tasting of minerals and open sky. They dined with minimal conversation, but the quietness felt rich rather than hollow. "I must share something with you," Talon said after they'd finished eating. Something in his manner made her set aside her cup and offer complete attention. "Today, seeing you ascending that trail," he paused, apparently seeking words, "I understood something I should have grasped earlier." "What?" "I'd been frightened," he admitted simply, "of requiring someone, of allowing someone to matter enough to cause me pain." His honesty left her breathless. She considered her own careful defenses, barriers she'd constructed against disappointment and loss. How long had they both existed as if caring posed danger, as if connection inevitably brought suffering? "And now?" she asked. "Now, I believe. The risk might be worthwhile." His dark eyes met hers across the small table. "If you're willing to take it with me." The question hung between them like smoke, visible and substantial. This was the moment Yazi had mentioned, the choice that couldn't be made carelessly or easily reversed: remain or depart, risk or security, the familiar existence that no longer suited her, or this new possibility demanding everything. Yet as she studied his face, serious, hopeful, afraid, Samantha realized the decision had been made somewhere within the smoke and difficulty of the day. Perhaps it had been decided even earlier, through all the small moments of care and attention that had accumulated like sediment, building something solid beneath the surface. "Yes," she replied simply. The words seemed to liberate something in both of them. Talon reached across the table to clasp her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt both novel and inevitable. His palm was warm, roughened, from years of careful labor, strong enough to carry wounded strangers up impossible routes. That evening they remained by the fire until late, not speaking, but not separate. The flames cast shifting shadows on the cabin walls, and outside the desert settled into its nocturnal patterns. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, answered by another, their voices weaving together in timeless dialogue. When Samantha finally retired, she fell asleep instantly, exhausted but whole. In her dreams she was walking, not fleeing from something but moving toward it, her steps confident and unhurried, her direction finally certain. The following weeks established rhythms neither familiar nor entirely foreign. Samantha awakened each morning to sounds of Talon moving about the cabin, but now she rose with him, sharing quiet rituals of coffee and bread as dawn light crept across canyon walls. Her vehicle, still stranded where it had failed 3 weeks earlier, had been towed to the village for repairs costing more than the car's value. The practical choice was clear, but it felt symbolic too, severing the final mechanical link to her former life. "I need to retrieve my belongings," she informed Talon one morning as they worked together in the garden. "From Phoenix." He nodded, his hands continuing their work among the bean plants. "When?" "Soon. There's not much, really. Clothing, some books, medical supplies I thought I might need. She paused, considering. I should probably submit my resignation at the hospital too. The words felt strange on her tongue. For 7 years, her identity had been so connected to that work, to the rhythm of shifts and immediate demands of trauma care. But sitting here in morning light, her hands learning the texture of soil and growing things, that life seemed to belong to someone else. You don't have to decide everything immediately, Talon said quietly. She looked up from the tomato plant she'd been supporting. Don't I? Yazi says major changes require time to settle, like seeds. You plant them, but you don't know what will grow until later. It was the kind of wisdom that came from living close to natural cycles, from understanding that some processes couldn't be hurried. But Samantha felt the pull of decision, the need to commit fully to whatever came next. They made the journey to Phoenix 2 days later, driving Talon's truck through landscape that shifted gradually from red rock and sage to urban sprawl and strip malls. The closer they approached the city, the more alien it seemed. Too fast, too loud, too disconnected from rhythms that had begun to feel natural. Her apartment, when she unlocked the door, smelled of closed spaces and accumulated dust. The furniture appeared smaller than she remembered. The rooms cramped after weeks of open sky and endless horizons. But there were items here that mattered. Medical textbooks that had seen her through nursing school, her grandmother's quilt, photographs holding the accumulated weight of family history. Talon assisted her packing with the same careful attention he brought to everything else, inquiring about items he didn't recognize, handling her books and keepsakes as if they held significance he couldn't understand but respected nonetheless. When they finished, everything she wanted to keep fit into 3 boxes and 2 suitcases. That's all? He asked, looking around the nearly empty apartment. That's all. She felt lighter already, unburdened by possessions that had accumulated without intention or meaning. The hospital was more difficult. 7 years of accumulated relationships, of professional identity built through crisis and routine. Her supervisor, understanding but disappointed, tried to negotiate a sabbatical instead of resignation. You're one of our finest trauma nurses, she said. Take a leave of absence. See how you feel in 6 months. It was a reasonable offer, a safety net that would allow retreat if this new life proved too difficult or too different. But Samantha found herself shaking her head. I don't think I'll be returning, she said. Walking out of the hospital for the final time felt like shedding skin. The woman who had worked those halls, who had found identity in competence and professional recognition, was someone she had been but no longer was. What came next remained unclear, but the uncertainty felt more like possibility than loss. That evening, in a hotel room that felt anonymous and temporary, Talon asked the question she'd been expecting. Any regrets? Samantha considered, looking out the window at city lights that seemed harsh after weeks of firelight and starshine. About leaving? No. About not doing it sooner? Maybe. It's not too late to change your mind. She turned from the window to study his face, noting the careful neutrality that meant he was holding back emotion. Even now, after everything they'd shared, he was prepared to let her go, if that's what she chose. Do you want me to change my mind? No. The answer came without hesitation, but I want you to be sure. I am sure. And as she said it, Samantha realized it was true. The certainty hadn't come all at once, but had built gradually through accumulated moments of recognition and choice. I'm more sure of this than I've been of anything in years. That night they made love for the first time, their bodies finding a rhythm as natural as breathing. Afterward, as Talon slept beside her, Samantha lay awake listening to the alien sounds of the city. Sirens, traffic, the constant hum of a place that never fully rested. Tomorrow they would drive back to the cabin, to the life she was choosing. But tonight she felt suspended between worlds, grateful for both what she was leaving and what she was moving toward. The turquoise stone, warm in her palm beside the hotel bed, seemed to pulse with its own quiet celebration. Spring arrived early in the desert, announcing itself in subtle ways: a softening of light, new growth on the patio, the return of birds that had wintered elsewhere. Samantha, now living completely in desert time, noticed these changes with attention that would have been impossible in her previous life. The canoe Talon had made sat finished in the workshop, waiting for water warm enough to launch. When that day came, he carried it to the creek with ceremony that spoke of years of similar moments, the completion of something made with hands and time, the offering of skill to the continuing life of the community. "Are you ready?" he asked. As they stood beside the water, Samantha looked at the canoe, beautiful, perfect, somehow exactly right for the two of them, and felt a flutter of nervousness she hadn't expected. Learning to paddle meant trusting not just Talon's instruction, but her own ability to read water, to respond to current and obstacle with the kind of fluid attention he'd been teaching her in other areas. "Ready," she said. The first lesson was about balance, not just physical but something deeper. How to sit in the canoe without fighting its movement. How to let the water support the craft while working with, rather than against, its natural tendency to drift and turn. Talon paddled, stern, his strokes economical and precise, calling quiet instructions that helped her find the rhythm. By the end of the afternoon, they'd traveled several miles downstream, past places Samantha had seen only from land. The perspective from water revealed new aspects of familiar landscape: hidden side canyons, stone formations invisible from the paths they usually walked, the intricate relationships between water and everything it touched. "How do you feel?" Talon asked, as they pulled the canoe onto shore near the cabin. "Different," she said, and realized she meant it. Something about moving through landscape rather than over. It had shifted her understanding of place, of her own relationship to the vast country surrounding them. That evening they sat by the fire with Yazi, who had come for dinner and stayed for conversation. The older woman had watched Samantha's integration into the community with the same careful attention she gave to everything important, offering guidance without judgment, wisdom without pressure. "You're planning to stay through summer," Yazi said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," Samantha replied. "If the community is willing to have me." "The community voted," Yazi said with a small smile. "Last week, unanimous approval for residency status." The words hit Samantha with unexpected force. She'd known her acceptance was provisional, subject to evaluation by people who understood this place and its needs far better than she did. To have passed that evaluation, to be formally welcomed rather than simply tolerated, felt like a recognition she hadn't realized she'd been seeking. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means you belong here now," Talon said quietly, "not as a visitor, as family." The concept of family in this context carried weight different from blood relationships. It spoke of chosen connection, of responsibility, freely accepted, of trust earned through shared experience and demonstrated commitment. Samantha felt the magnitude of what was being offered, and with it the responsibility of proving worthy. "There's something else," Yazi continued. "The clinic needs a nurse, part-time but regular, someone who understands both medical practice and the way we prefer to approach healing." The offer solved a problem Samantha had been avoiding: how to contribute meaningfully to the community, how to use her skills in service of something larger than herself. Traditional employment seemed impossible in this place that functioned according to older principles. But this felt different. This felt like integration. What would that involve? Basic medical care mostly, immunizations, treatment of minor injuries, health education, some emergency response when needed. Yazi's expression grew serious. and learning about traditional healing practices, about the relationship between physical health and spiritual balance. It was exactly the kind of work Samantha had dreamed of during her years in trauma medicine. Patient-centered care that addressed the whole person rather than isolated symptoms. Healing that recognized the connections between individual health and community well-being. "I'd like that," she said simply. "Good, you start Monday." That night, after Yazi had returned to the village, Samantha and Talon walked to the creek where the canoe waited, pulled up on shore for the night. The water moved past them with its eternal murmuring, carrying moonlight and the reflection of stars toward distant destinations. "Are you happy?" Talon asked, the question coming from the comfortable darkness between them. Samantha considered trying to find words for the deep satisfaction that had been growing in her daily life, the pleasure of work that mattered, the rhythm of seasons, and growing things, the quiet joy of partnership with someone who understood the value of attention and care. "Happy feels too small," she said finally. "I feel settled, like I'm finally where I'm supposed to be." Talon's hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers warm and strong. "Me too," he said simply. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching water move past stone, feeling themselves part of something larger and more enduring than their individual stories. Above them, stars wheeled in patterns unchanged, since the first people had looked up from this same ground, seeking navigation and meaning in the vast dark. 1 year later, Samantha woke before dawn to the sound of rain on the cabin roof. Desert. Rain, when it came, arrived with purpose, steady, soaking, transforming dust to mud, and awakening seeds that had waited months for exactly this condition. Beside her, Talon stirred but didn't wake. His face in the dim light looked peaceful, younger somehow, as if the chronic tension he'd carried when they first met had finally eased. She watched him sleep for a moment, marveling at the simple privilege of knowing someone this completely, of being known in return. The clinic would be closed today. Rain meant muddy roads, and the kind of day when people stayed home unless truly necessary. But Samantha felt no disappointment at the change in routine. She'd learned to read weather as communication rather than inconvenience, to adjust her plans according to conditions beyond human control. She rose quietly and made coffee, then settled in the chair by the window to watch the rain transform the landscape. The red rocks darkened to deep burgundy, and the creek, usually a modest stream, began to swell with runoff from higher elevations. By full daylight, it would be running high and brown, carrying the mountain's gifts toward distant rivers. Talon woke as light began to filter through the rain clouds, his internal clock adjusted to desert rhythms despite the changed conditions. He joined her at the window, coffee cup in hand, watching water remake the world they thought they knew. "Good day for inside work," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. Samantha nodded, then turned to study his profile. "I have something to tell you." Something in her tone made him look at her directly, his dark eyes alert despite the early hour. "What?" "I'm pregnant." The words hung between them like morning mist, visible and transformative. Samantha watched, his face cycle through surprise, calculation, something that might have been fear, and finally, slowly, a joy so complete it made her chest ache. "How long have you known?" 2 weeks. "I wanted to be sure before—" She gestured vaguely toward the complexity of what this meant for both of them. Talon set down his coffee cup and turned to face her completely. "How do you feel about it?" It was exactly the question she'd expected. From him, not assumption about what she should feel, but genuine curiosity about her actual experience. It was one of the many things she'd learned to love about him, this careful attention to her inner life rather than his own expectations. "Scared," she said honestly. "Happy, uncertain about timing." She paused, searching for words that would capture the complexity. Complete somehow, like this was always part of what was supposed to happen, even when I couldn't see it. Talon reached for her hands, holding them gently between his calloused palms. "We'll figure it out as we go," he said. "Together." The rain continued through the morning, a steady drumming that created its own privacy. They spent the day talking about practical considerations, about fears and hopes, about the kind of parents they wanted to be. Talon spoke of traditional ways of raising children in connection to land and community, while Samantha brought perspectives from her medical training and her own childhood experiences. By afternoon, when the rain finally stopped, they'd begun to envision a future that felt both challenging and deeply right. A child raised between worlds, grounded in place but aware of larger possibilities, a new life that would carry forward the best of what they'd both learned about healing, attention, and love. Yazi arrived in the evening, ostensibly to check on them after the storm, but clearly drawn by intuition that something had changed. When they told her the news, her face lit with a joy that seemed to encompass generations. "Good timing," she said simply. "Children need to be born into hope." That night, as they prepared for bed, Samantha found herself thinking about the woman who had driven into this desert 13 months ago, broken, lost, running from everything she couldn't face. That woman would never have believed herself capable of the life she was now living, the love she'd discovered, the future taking shape with each passing day. She pulled out the journal Talon had given her so long ago, its pages now filled with observations, reflections, and the gradual mapping of a life transformed. On a fresh page she wrote, "Today I told Talon about the baby. Today we began planning for a future I never could have imagined. Today I understood that sometimes what looks like an ending is actually the beginning of everything that matters." The turquoise stone sits on my bedside table, warm with held heat and accumulated blessings. Tomorrow we'll begin building a crib from wood Talon has been seasoning for exactly this purpose, though neither of us knew it at the time. Tomorrow we'll start teaching our child about the relationship between patience and growth, about the way love expresses itself through daily attention, about the courage required to trust in tomorrow. But tonight we rest in the knowledge that we have found our place, our purpose, our people. Tonight, rain-washed air carries the scent of sage and possibility through open windows, and somewhere in the distance, coyotes call to each other across the vast spaces that have become home. Tonight, we are exactly where we belong. She closed the journal and turned to find Talon watching her, his expression soft with the kind of contentment that comes not from having everything you want, but from wanting everything you have. Outside, the desert settled into its nighttime rhythms, patient and eternal, holding their small human happiness within the larger story of stone and star and endless becoming. The turquoise stone caught moonlight from the window, its surface glowing with the deep blue-green of water and sunlight, of promise kept, of love that had found its proper ground. In the morning, they would begin building the future they had chosen, together. But tonight was perfect exactly as it was, full of rain scent and quiet breathing, of plans taking shape and hearts finally at peace.